In 1885 Montana Territory, a desperate mother flees into the wilderness with her newborn to escape her violent husband, only to be discovered by a mysterious widower living alone in a remote cabin. What neither of them realizes is that this chance encounter will not only save them from approaching danger, but forge an unexpected bond that will be tested when her vengeful husband tracks them down. But will their fragile new connection survive when the past returns with deadly intentions? The gunshot cracked through the morning air as Vernon Tate's bullet splintered the doorframe inches from Eleanor's head. Her body moved before her mind could catch up, fingers snatching the already packed bundle from beneath their bed. The baby, just 6 days old, woke with a startled cry that pierced Eleanor's heart like a knife. "Where do you think you're running to?" Vernon's voice slurred from the main room, the familiar sound of a whiskey bottle clinking against the table. "That brat hasn't stopped screaming since you brought it home." Montana Territory, 1885. The isolated cabin that had been Eleanor's prison for 3 years suddenly felt smaller than ever. The fresh bruises on her arms throbbed beneath her sleeves as she pressed her daughter against her chest, slipping through the back window while Vernon reloaded his rifle. "Hush now, little Sarah," she whispered, her lips brushing the downy golden hair that matched her own. "Mama's got you." Blood trickled warm down Eleanor's cheek where Vernon's ring had split her skin open last night. That had been the final straw, not the first time he'd hurt her, but the first time he'd done it while she held their baby. Something inside her had shattered then, replaced by a burning certainty. They wouldn't survive another week under Vernon's roof. The April morning hung crisp and cool around them as Eleanor plunged into the shelter of the pines behind their cabin. She hadn't dared take much, just the clothes on her back, a water canteen, a small pouch of coins she'd secretly saved, and a woolen blanket for Sarah. The thin shawl around her shoulders would do little against the mountain chill, but she'd endure any hardship to put miles between her child and that man. "Eleanor!" Vernon's bellow echoed through the trees, sending birds scattering into the sky. She froze momentarily, instinct making her want to answer, to apologize, to return before his anger grew worse. But Sarah's tiny fingers clutched at her dress, and Eleanor forced her trembling legs forward. The railway station in Missoula lay 20 miles north. If she followed the creek, staying off the main trails where Vernon might look for her, a twig snapped behind her. Eleanor spun around, heart hammering against her ribs. Nothing, just the wind stirring last autumn's fallen branches. But the momentary panic sent fresh determination coursing through her veins. She'd been afraid for too long. By midday, the spring sun beat down through the canopy, warming Eleanor's back as she picked her way along a deer trail that paralleled the creek. Her feet, clad only in thin leather house shoes, ached with each step. Sarah had mercifully fallen asleep, her warm weight both comfort and burden against Eleanor's chest. When she reached a small clearing, Eleanor paused to rest on a fallen log. The valley stretched below her, a patchwork of meadows and forest bathed in golden light. So beautiful, so vast, so empty. For the first time since fleeing, doubt crept into her mind. What was she thinking? A woman alone with a newborn in the wilderness? No food, no proper shelter, no protection from the elements or wild animals or men worse than Vernon. Sarah stirred against her, pink lips smacking in hunger. Eleanor unbuttoned her dress with shaking fingers, wincing as her daughter latched on eagerly. The pain in her breast was nothing compared to the ache in her heart. "I don't know where we're going," she admitted softly to her nursing child, "but I promise we'll find somewhere safe." A distant rumble of thunder made Eleanor glance up at the sky. Dark clouds gathered over the mountains to the west, promising a spring storm within hours. She needed to find shelter before nightfall or risk exposing Sarah to the deadly mountain cold. Forcing her blistered feet back into her shoes, Eleanor continued down the trail. Each step sent pain shooting up her legs, but she gritted her teeth and pushed on. The terrain grew steeper, forcing her to use one hand to steady herself against trees, while the other cradled Sarah. The first fat raindrops began to fall as the light faded from the sky. The temperature dropped rapidly, and Eleanor's thin dress clung to her skin. Sarah, disturbed by the cold and wet, began to whimper. Just a little farther, Eleanor promised, though she had no idea what lay ahead. Her vision blurred with exhaustion and tears as she stumbled forward. The crack of a branch breaking, not beneath her own feet this time, made her freeze. Heart pounding, she scanned the shadowy forest around her. That's when she saw him, a silhouette on horseback watching from the ridge above, the brim of his dark hat casting his face in shadow. The dying sun glinted off something metal at his throat. Eleanor clutched Sarah tighter and backed away slowly. Had Vernon sent someone after them already? Was this a stranger who might prove even more dangerous? The rider made no move toward her, but his gaze followed her retreat. Eleanor turned and hurried down the path, panic lending strength to her exhausted limbs. The storm broke in earnest, rain lashing down through the trees. Thunder crashed overhead as lightning split the darkening sky. Sarah wailed in protest, her cries nearly lost in the howling wind. Eleanor's foot caught on a root, sending her stumbling to her knees. She twisted her body to protect Sarah from the impact, crying out as her shoulders slammed against a rock. Pain shot down her arm, but she kept her grip on her child. "Please," she whispered, though to whom she wasn't sure. God had seemed deaf to her prayers these past years. "Please help us." The sound of hoofbeats approached from behind. Eleanor struggled to her feet, clutching Sarah to her chest with her good arm. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The rider appeared through the curtain of rain, his horse's breath steaming in the cold air. Eleanor pressed her back against a tree trunk, eyes searching desperately for an escape. "You shouldn't be out here," the man called over the storm, his voice deep but lacking Vernon's cruel edge. "Not with a child." Eleanor said nothing, her mind racing with terrible possibilities. If she ran, would he chase her? If she stayed, what would he do? The man dismounted slowly, keeping his distance. Water streamed from the brim of his hat as he raised his hands slightly, showing they were empty. "I mean no harm," he said, softer now. "But this storm's only getting worse." As if to confirm his words, lightning cracked nearby, the thunder following so quickly that Eleanor felt it rumble through her bones. Sarah screamed in terror, her tiny body shaking against Eleanor's chest. The stranger took another step forward, close enough now that Eleanor could make out his features in the fading light. Weathered skin, dark beard flecked with gray, eyes that held concern rather than threat. "I have a cabin," he said. "Dry, warm, 2 miles east." Eleanor hesitated, torn between the devil she didn't know and the certain danger of the night. Sarah's cries grew weaker, her little body chilled despite Eleanor's efforts to shield her. "Why would you help us?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely audible above the storm. Something flashed across the man's face, pain, perhaps, or memory. "Because no one should be alone out here," he answered simply. "Especially not a mother and child." Another lightning strike illuminated the forest around them, closer this time. In that brief, blinding flash, Eleanor saw the metal that had caught the sunlight earlier. Not a weapon, but a simple silver cross hanging from a leather cord around the stranger's neck. Was it a sign, or just another trap? Sarah's whimpers had faded to hiccuping breaths, her body trembling with cold. Eleanor knew that babies could die from exposure in hours, not days. Whatever risk this man presented couldn't be worse than the certain death that awaited them in the storm. "All right," she said, the words nearly choking her. "But I'm warning you." The threat died on her lips. What could she possibly do against him if he meant them harm? The man nodded once, understanding her unspoken fear. "I'm Daniel Holt," he said, leading his horse closer. "And I swear on my late wife's grave, you'll come to no harm under my roof." Eleanor stood frozen, the rain soaking through to her skin, as she faced the moment that would either save their lives or seal their fate. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across Daniel Holt's one-room cabin. Eleanor sat rigid in a chair pulled close to the warmth, her sleeping daughter bundled in a clean blanket against her chest. Her soaked dress had been replaced by a man's flannel shirt and wool trousers, both far too large but blessedly dry. She changed behind a hung quilt while Daniel waited outside, despite the driving rain. It's not much, Daniel said, setting a steaming mug on the table beside her. But the tea will warm you. Eleanor studied him over Sarah's head. In the lamplight, she could see him clearly for the first time, tall and broad-shouldered, with calloused hands that spoke of hard work. His dark hair and beard framed a face that wasn't handsome in the traditional sense, but had a quiet strength that reminded Eleanor of the mountains themselves. "Thank you," she said cautiously, reaching for the mug with her free hand. The ceramic burned against her cold fingers, but she welcomed the pain. It meant she was alive. Daniel busied himself at the iron stove, his back turned to give her space. "There's stew," he said. "You should eat something." The mention of food made Eleanor's stomach clench painfully. When had she last eaten? Yesterday morning, perhaps. Vernon had thrown her plate against the wall when she'd asked him to quiet down while the baby slept. "Why are you helping us?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Daniel paused, a wooden spoon held suspended over the pot. For a long moment he didn't answer. Then, without turning, he nodded toward the small shelf above the fireplace. A daguerreotype in a simple wooden frame stood there, a woman with gentle eyes holding a small boy on her lap. Beside it sat a smaller frame containing a dried wildflower. "My wife, Catherine," Daniel said softly, "and our son, Joseph." The past tense hung in the air between them. Eleanor didn't need to ask what had happened. Out here, death came in countless forms. Illness, accidents, childbirth, the harsh winters. "I'm sorry," she offered. Daniel shrugged, a gesture that didn't match the pain in his eyes when he finally turned to face her. 3 years ago, influenza took them both within a week of each other. Eleanor glanced down at Sarah, her throat tightening at the thought of such loss. Though sometimes, in her darkest moments with Vernon, she'd wondered if death might be kinder than the life they led. "My name is Eleanor," she said, offering something in return for his honesty. "And this is Sarah." She didn't give her surname. If Vernon came looking, and he would, his pride wouldn't allow her to escape. She didn't want to make Daniel complicit in harboring them. "How old?" Daniel asked, nodding at the baby as he ladled stew into a bowl. 6 days. His eyebrows rose slightly, but he made no comment about her traveling so soon after childbirth. Instead, he set the bowl on the table and retreated to give her space. The stew smelled rich and hearty venison with wild onions and potatoes. Eleanor's hunger overcame her caution, and she ate quickly, one-handed, while Sarah slept against her shoulder. "The storm set in for the night," Daniel said, gazing out the small window where rain lashed against the glass. "Roads will be washed out by morning." Eleanor tensed. Was he telling her they were trapped here? Her fingers tightened around the spoon. Daniel seemed to sense her fear. "I'll sleep in the stable with the horses," he said. "You can bar the door from inside." Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by shame. This man had shown nothing but kindness, yet she was treating him like Vernon. "That's not necessary," she began, but Daniel shook his head. "It is," he said simply. "You have no reason to trust me, and every reason to be cautious." The understanding in his voice nearly undid her. When had anyone last considered her feelings, her safety? As if sensing the tension, Sarah stirred and began to fuss. The infant's face screwed up, her cries starting as whimpers before building toward a full wail. "She's hungry," Eleanor explained, embarrassment heating her cheeks. "I need to." "Of course," Daniel said quickly, turning away to give her privacy. "I'll check on the horses." He grabbed his coat and slipped outside into the storm, leaving Eleanor alone with her daughter. The simple courtesy of it, the respect, made her blink back unexpected tears. As Sarah nursed, Eleanor's gaze wandered around the cabin. It was small but meticulously maintained. A quilt in a pattern of blue and white stars covered the single bed. Dried herbs hung from the rafters. Books, actual books, lined a small shelf beside the fireplace. Everything spoke of care, of permanence, of a life built through patient labor. So different from the chaos and neglect of Vernon's cabin, where broken furniture and empty bottles competed for space. A crack of thunder made the windows rattle. Sarah startled against her breast, and Eleanor stroked her daughter's cheek soothingly. "It's all right," she murmured. "We're safe here. But for how long?" The question nagged at her as she burped Sarah and changed her swaddling clothes using a clean fabric Daniel had left out. By first light, she needed to be moving toward Missoula, toward the train that would take them. Where? She had no family, no friends who wouldn't turn her back over to Vernon. The door opened, bringing a gust of cold air and rain. Daniel stomped his boots on the threshold, shaking water from his coat. "Sorry," he said, noticing Sarah was awake. "Storm's getting worse. Creek's already rising." Eleanor's heart sank. "Will it flood?" "Not up here," Daniel assured her, hanging his wet coat by the door. "But the valley trail you were following will be underwater by morning." The implications settled heavily on Eleanor's shoulders. She was trapped here, if not by Daniel, then by nature itself. "I need to reach Missoula," she said, hating the desperation in her voice. Daniel studied her face for a long moment, his eyes lingering on the cut on her cheek that had finally stopped bleeding. "You're running from someone," he said. "Not a question." Eleanor stiffened. "I should put Sarah down to sleep." Daniel didn't press. Instead, he pulled a small trunk from beneath the bed and opened it, revealing neatly folded baby clothes. "These were Joseph's," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "They might be big for her, but they're clean and warm." The unexpected kindness broke something inside Eleanor. A sob escaped before she could stop it, and she pressed her lips together hard. "I can't repay you," she whispered. "I'm not asking for payment." Daniel selected a soft woolen gown from the trunk and placed it beside her. "Just trying to be a decent human being." Eleanor couldn't remember the last time someone had been decent to her. Vernon had been charming once, during their brief courtship after her parents died. But that mask had slipped on their wedding night, revealing the monster beneath. "My husband will come looking for us," she said, the admission torn from her throat. "He's not a good man." Daniel's expression hardened, his gaze flicking to her bruised arms, the cut on her cheek. "I figured as much. If he finds us here, he'll hurt you," Eleanor continued. "Maybe worse. Vernon doesn't share what he considers his property." "You're not property," Daniel said, his voice low with controlled anger. Not directed at her, she realized, but at the situation. "Vernon. In the eyes of the law, I am," Eleanor replied bitterly. "Him and everything that belongs to him." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, stoking the fire with more wood. The flames leapt higher, casting his profile in sharp relief against the cabin wall. "The law doesn't reach everywhere in these mountains," he said finally. "And I'm not afraid of men like your husband." He should be, Eleanor thought. Vernon had killed before, a man in a saloon who'd looked at Eleanor too long. The sheriff had called it self-defense, and no one questioned it. No one ever questioned Vernon Tate. Sarah's eyelids drooped as she fought sleep, tiny fists waving in the air. Eleanor rocked her gently, humming a lullaby her own mother had sung long ago. "You sing beautifully," Daniel commented, the compliment so unexpected that Eleanor faltered. "My mother taught me," she said softly, "before the consumption took her." "My Catherine sang too," Daniel replied, a distant smile touching his lips. "Every evening, no matter how hard the day had been." For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, the storm raging outside while the fire crackled between them. Two people touched by loss, finding brief connection in shared memory. "You should take the bed," Daniel said eventually, breaking the spell. "I'll make a pallet here by the fire." Eleanor started to protest, but exhaustion weighed her limbs like lead. When had she last slept properly? Not since before Sarah's birth, certainly. "Just for tonight," she agreed reluctantly. "Tomorrow I need to move on." Daniel nodded, though something in his expression suggested doubt. "We'll see what the weather brings," was all he said. As Eleanor settled into the bed, Sarah nestled in the crook of her arm. She found herself studying the ceiling beams above her. This cabin, built by Daniel's hands, felt solid in a way Vernon's never had. safe despite her fears. A distant memory surfaced, her father telling her once that you could judge a man's character by the home he kept. Vernon's cabin had always been chaotic, dirty, broken things piled in corners. Daniel's, though simple, spoke of care and attention. She turned her head slightly, watching as Daniel arranged blankets on the floor near the hearth, his movements efficient and quiet. He caught her looking and gave a small nod of reassurance before turning his back to give her privacy. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, rattling the shutters and driving rain against the roof. But inside, the fire's warmth wrapped around Eleanor like a physical embrace. For the first time in years, she fell asleep without fear of what the night might bring. And just before consciousness slipped away, a dangerous thought crossed her mind. What if they didn't have to leave at all? Blood trickled from Eleanor's blistered heel as she limped across the threshold of Daniel Holt's cabin. The storm outside hurled sheets of icy rain against the windows, drowning the howl of distant wolves. Sarah whimpered against her chest, tiny fingers grasping at the frayed collar of Eleanor's dress. "She's hungry," Eleanor whispered, the first words she'd spoken since they'd arrived. Her throat felt raw and used. Daniel moved with surprising gentleness for such a large man. He struck a match, and golden light bloomed inside the oil lamp, revealing a single room that somehow managed to feel like a real home, not just shelter. "Sit," he said, pulling out a chair by the unlit stove. "I'll build a fire." The cabin smelled of pine, coffee, and something else. Something masculine but not unpleasant. As Eleanor sank onto the wooden chair, she noticed how neatly everything was arranged. Tin plates stacked on open shelves, 3 books lined perfectly on a small table, a hand-carved chess set with pieces frozen mid-game. "You can't play chess alone," she blurted, then flushed. Of all the things to say, Daniel glanced up from where he knelt at the stove, kindling catching beneath his skilled hands. "My son and I—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "I keep the board as he left it." The flames licked upward, casting dancing shadows across his face. In that moment, Eleanor saw not a stranger, but a man whose pain mirrored her own. Different in cause, but the same in depth. "You must think I'm awful," Eleanor said suddenly, bouncing Sarah as she began to fuss. "Running away in the night with a baby. Like a thief." Daniel stood, dusting his hands on his trousers. "Folks run for good reasons, usually." His eyes flickered to the bruise on her cheek, then away, giving her privacy in her shame. "Water's in that bucket, clean from the spring. Behind that blanket," he nodded toward a corner where a quilt hung from a rope. "You can have some privacy. I'll step outside to check on the horse." Before Eleanor could thank him, he'd grabbed his coat and slipped out the door, leaving her alone in the suddenly quiet cabin. "He's a good man," she whispered to Sarah, unexpected tears stinging her eyes. "I'd forgotten they existed." 20 minutes later, Eleanor sat wrapped in a borrowed blanket, her damp hair combed and Sarah finally nursing contentedly. The cabin had warmed quickly, and for the first time in days, she didn't feel the bone-deep chill of fear. The door opened with a soft creak. Daniel entered, carrying a bucket of fresh milk and what looked like a small bag of cornmeal. He kept his eyes averted, respecting her privacy as she fed the baby. "Town's a good 3 days' ride," he said, setting his supplies on a small work table. "And that's in fair weather. The miller's wife had a baby last spring. Might have some things you could use. I can ride there tomorrow if the rain stops." Eleanor adjusted her shawl. "Why are you helping us?" she asked, unable to keep the suspicion from her voice. Vernon had seemed kind too at first. Daniel hung his dripping coat on a peg by the door. His shoulders were broad beneath his flannel shirt, but he moved with an economy that suggested no wasted motion, no hidden violence. "My Catherine," he began, then paused, eyes moving to a framed photograph on the wall. A woman with kind eyes and a young boy standing stiffly beside her. "My wife would have done the same." "She's gone?" Eleanor asked softly. Daniel nodded once, sharply. 3 years passed. Thomas too, my son. Diphtheria took them both in a week. The raw grief in his voice made Eleanor's chest ache. "I'm sorry." An unexpected knock at the door made them both freeze. Daniel's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle mounted on wall pegs. "Holt! You in there?" A gruff voice called from outside. Daniel's posture relaxed slightly. "Just Granger," he said quietly to Eleanor. "Trapper. Has a cabin 5 miles north." Then louder, "Come in, Granger." Doors unlatched. A gust of wet wind swept in with the newcomer, a gray-bearded man in a sodden fur cap. His sharp eyes took in Eleanor and Sarah before fixing on Daniel with undisguised curiosity. "Didn't know you had company, Holt?" he said, removing his dripping hat. "Mrs. Palmer and her daughter," Daniel replied smoothly, the lie rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. "My wife's cousin from St. Louis, traveling to her sister's in Helena when the storm caught them. Their driver abandoned them with the wagon stuck in mud." Eleanor fought to keep her expression neutral, grateful for Daniel's quick thinking. "Shameful business, leaving a woman and child," Granger said, shaking his head. "Some men ain't worth the powder to blow 'em to hell." He turned to Eleanor with a stiff nod. "Ma'am." "Mr. Granger," she replied softly, praying Sarah wouldn't choose that moment to wake and cry. "Came to warn you, Holt," the trapper continued. "Spotted 3 men near Pine Creek yesterday. Rough types. Armed. Asked after a woman and baby. Offered money for information." The air in the cabin seemed to thin. Eleanor clutched Sarah tighter, feeling as though she might faint. "Obliged for the warning," Daniel said calmly, though Eleanor noticed his hand still rested near the rifle. "You tell them anything?" Granger snorted. "Told them I hadn't seen hide nor hair of anyone for weeks." He glanced at Eleanor again, eyes narrowing slightly. "Don't make it my business to help men who hunt women." The implication hung clear in the air. Granger suspected something, but he'd chosen his side. "There's coffee if you want it," Daniel offered, moving toward the stove. Granger shook his head. "Best get back before dark. Wolves are hungry this spring." He resettled his hat, then paused. "Milner's coming through on Friday. Brings mail and supplies from town. Want me to tell him you need anything?" Daniel considered. "Baby things if he's got 'em. Cloth diapers. Something for colic." The trapper nodded. "Will do." At the door he turned. "Mrs. Palmer, you and the little one stay safe." When the door closed behind him, Eleanor released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Vernon's men," she whispered, terror clawing at her throat. "He's looking for us." Daniel pulled a chair closer to hers, not touching her but near enough that she could feel the solid, reassuring presence of him. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and steady. "No one's taking you or your baby anywhere you don't want to go. Not while you're under my roof." Eleanor looked up, searching his face for deceit, for hidden motives, for the anger that had always lurked beneath Vernon's promises. She found none. "Why?" she asked again, needing to understand. Daniel was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice had roughened. "Because when Catherine and Thomas were sick, I begged for help. Rode to 3 neighboring homesteads. Not one would let me cross their land for fear of the sickness." His hands, resting on his knees, curled into fists. "I watched my family die because people were afraid to help." The confession hung between them, raw and unvarnished. "I'm sorry," Eleanor whispered, her free hand moving of its own accord to rest lightly on his forearm. Daniel looked at her hand on his arm as though he'd forgotten what human touch felt like. "You need rest," he said gruffly, standing. "Take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire." Eleanor felt a flutter of panic. "The floor is fine for us." "The bed," Daniel repeated firmly. "It's clean. I changed the linens last week." He turned away, busying himself with arranging bedding on the floor near the stove. Eleanor realized with sudden clarity that this was a man accustomed to being alone with his grief, to moving through the world with the expectation of nothing beyond his own survival. She knew that feeling intimately. Sarah had fallen asleep at her breast. Carefully, Eleanor rose and moved to the narrow bed tucked in the corner. The quilt that covered it was hand-stitched in a pattern of stars. Made with care, made with love. "Your wife made this?" she asked softly. Daniel glanced up. "Yes, she made one for every bed in the house. Said a home needed handmade things." Eleanor traced the stitches with her fingertips. She was right. Later, as rain drummed against the roof and Sarah slept in a drawer lined with soft flannel beside the bed, Eleanor lay awake, listening to Daniel's even breathing from his place by the stove. For the first time in years, she didn't fall asleep afraid. But outside, beyond the circle of warmth and safety, 3 riders made camp beneath a rocky outcropping, passing a bottle of whiskey as they waited for dawn and the hunt to resume. The morning light spilled through the cabin window, catching floating dust motes in its golden beams. Daniel Holt sat motionless at his small table, whittling a piece of pine with practiced hands. Every few moments, his eyes would drift to the sleeping forms of Eleanor and Sarah, as if to reassure himself they were still there, still real. The woman had screamed in her sleep twice during the night. Terrible, strangled sounds that had him reaching for his rifle before he realized the danger existed only in her dreams. He hadn't woken her, sensing that dreams might be safer than the memories that caused them. A small cry from the makeshift cradle brought Daniel's attention back to the present. The baby was awake, tiny fists waving in the air, face scrunching in preparation for a proper wail. Moving quietly, he reached the cradle before Eleanor stirred. Awkwardly, he lifted the small bundle, surprised by how light she was, how perfectly she fit in his weathered hands. "Sure, little one," he whispered, bouncing slightly as he'd seen Eleanor do. "Your mama needs rest." The baby's eyes, startlingly blue and somehow ancient, fixed on his face. Her cries subsided to curious gurgles. "That's it," Daniel murmured, carrying her to the rocking chair by the window. "We'll let her sleep a bit longer." The floorboards creaked beneath the rocker as Daniel settled into a gentle rhythm. Sarah's tiny hand wrapped around his calloused finger with surprising strength. "You're a fighter," he told her solemnly. "Like your mama." From the bed, Eleanor watched through half-closed eyes, not daring to move. The sight of her daughter cradled safely in Daniel's arms stirred something painful yet sweet in her chest. A longing for what should have been, for the kind of father Sarah deserved. Vernon had refused to hold the baby after she was born, declaring her too scrawny and probably not worth the raising. His disappointment at having a daughter instead of a son had turned his casual cruelty into something more targeted, more dangerous. The morning after Sarah's birth, Eleanor had found him standing over the cradle, studying the infant with cold eyes. "Nothing of me in her," he'd said. That's when Eleanor knew they had to run. The floor creaked as she shifted, and Daniel looked up, meeting her gaze across the room. "Hope you don't mind," he said, gesturing to Sarah. "She was about to wake you." Eleanor sat up, pushing tangled hair from her face. "You're good with her." A shadow passed over Daniel's features. "Had practice once." The simple statement contained oceans of grief. Eleanor slipped from the bed, wrapping the quilt around her shoulders against the morning chill. "I should take her. She'll be hungry." Daniel nodded, carefully transferring Sarah to her mother's arms. Their hands brushed in the exchange, and Eleanor was struck by the gentleness in his touch, so at odds with his rugged appearance. "I'll step out," he said, reaching for his coat. "Give you privacy." "You don't have to leave your own home," Eleanor protested. "I can go behind the curtain." Daniel paused, hat in hand. "Need to check the perimeter anyway." After what Granger said, he let the sentence hang unfinished between them. Fear, momentarily forgotten in the peaceful morning light, crashed back like a wave. "Do you think they'll come here?" "Eventually." Daniel's honesty was oddly comforting. No false reassurances, no patronizing comfort. "But not today, I'd wager. Rain's washed away any tracks you might have left." Eleanor nodded, bouncing Sarah as she began to fuss in earnest. "What will we do when they do come?" Daniel settled his hat on his head, expression hardening. "Cross that bridge when we reach it." For now, you both need food and rest. He moved to the door, then hesitated. You'll be here when I get back? The question surprised her. Where else would I go? Something like relief flickered across his face. Nowhere, I suppose. Not in this weather. He reached for the door handle. I'll bring firewood. After he'd gone, Eleanor settled into the rocking chair he'd vacated, adjusting her dress to feed Sarah. Through the window, she watched Daniel walk the perimeter of the small clearing, rifle cradled in his arms, eyes constantly scanning the tree line, standing guard, protecting them. The concept was so foreign she almost couldn't comprehend it. By midday, the rain had stopped, and weak sunlight struggled through dissipating clouds. Eleanor stood at the open door, breathing in the fresh, pine-scented air. Sarah slept peacefully in her drawer cradle, and Daniel had gone to check his snare lines, promising to return with rabbit for their supper. The cabin felt different in daylight, smaller, yet somehow more inviting. Eleanor had spent the morning exploring its corners while Daniel chopped firewood outside. She discovered carved wooden toys tucked in a chest beneath the window, a small collection of books, including, surprisingly, a volume of Tennyson's poetry, and a box containing a woman's simple jewelry, a gold locket, a string of pearls, a silver brooch. Catherine's things, carefully preserved but hidden away. The evidence of a life interrupted, of love suspended in grief. Eleanor closed the door and turned back to the cabin's interior. Without conscious thought, she began to tidy, needing occupation for her restless hands. She straightened the already neat shelves, swept the plank floor with a straw broom, and folded Daniel's blankets from where he'd slept by the stove. In the corner beside the bed, she found a wooden chest with a hinged lid. Inside lay neatly folded children's clothing, a boy's things, small shirts and trousers, a hand-knitted sweater with a boat embroidered on its front. Thomas's clothes, preserved like everything else, folded with care by hands that couldn't bear to part with them. Eleanor closed the lid gently, feeling like an intruder in this man's carefully maintained grief. The sudden crack of a branch breaking outside froze her in place. Not from the direction Daniel had gone. From the opposite side of the clearing. Heart pounding, Eleanor moved silently to Sarah's cradle, lifting the sleeping baby and retreating to the corner where Daniel's rifle hung on pegs. She'd never fired a gun, but Vernon had many times. She knew the basic mechanism. Footsteps approached the cabin, too heavy for a deer, too deliberate for a wandering animal. Eleanor reached for the rifle with trembling hands. The door swung open. Whoa there! Daniel stood in the doorway, hands raised, eyes fixed on the rifle Eleanor had half lifted from its pegs. A string of rabbits hung from his belt, their fur matted with blood. It's just me. Eleanor sagged against the wall, legs suddenly weak. I heard something. Outside. Not from the direction you went. Daniel's expression changed instantly. He set the rabbits on the table and took the rifle from her unresisting hands. Stay here, he said quietly. Bar the door behind me. Daniel! Fear made her voice crack. Be careful. Something shifted in his eyes at the sound of his given name on her lips. He nodded once, then slipped out the door. Eleanor immediately slid the wooden bar into place, clutching Sarah to her chest as the baby began to stir. Through the window, she watched Daniel circle the cabin, rifle ready, movements precise and cautious. He disappeared into the tree line, and minutes stretched like hours as Eleanor waited, every sound magnified in her heightened awareness. When he finally reappeared, she nearly cried with relief. She unbarred the door before he reached it. What was it? Deer, he said, setting the rifle aside. Buck with a decent rack. Came to drink at the stream. The tension drained from Eleanor's body, so suddenly she had to grab the door frame for support. I know what you thought. Daniel's voice was gentle. And you were right to be cautious. You have good instincts, Eleanor. No one had ever said such a thing to her before. Vernon had constantly berated her for being jumpy and simple-minded, even as his unpredictable rages gave her every reason for vigilance. I should start on those rabbits, Daniel continued, gesturing to his catch. Unless you'd rather. I can do it, Eleanor said quickly, eager to be useful. I'm good with a knife. Daniel raised an eyebrow but handed her his hunting knife without comment. Eleanor laid Sarah in her cradle and set to work, her movements deft and practiced. Vernon may have been a cruel husband, but he'd expected her to prepare whatever game he brought home. You handle a blade well, Daniel observed, stoking the fire. Eleanor smiled faintly. One of my few talents my husband approved of. Daniel's expression darkened. The man sounds like a fool. A dangerous fool, Eleanor corrected, separating meat from bone with quick strokes. He'll kill me if he finds us. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had a steel edge she hadn't heard before. He'd have to go through me first. Eleanor's hands stilled over the rabbit. She looked up to find Daniel watching her, his gaze steady and resolute. You barely know us, she whispered. Why would you risk your life? Daniel moved to the window, looking out at the clearing where shadows had begun to lengthen as afternoon slipped toward evening. After Catherine and Thomas died, he said slowly, I thought about putting my rifle in my mouth, came close a few times. He turned back to face her. What stopped me was knowing they'd hate that choice. Catherine believed in going on, in finding purpose even in pain. He gestured to Eleanor and Sarah. Maybe you two are that purpose. Maybe protecting you is why I'm still here. The raw honesty of his confession hung in the air between them. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. I don't know if I'm worth dying for, she said quietly. Daniel's expression softened. Everyone is worth protecting, Eleanor. Everyone deserves safety, especially a mother and child. Before she could respond, Sarah began to cry in earnest. Eleanor wiped her hands and lifted the baby, who immediately nuzzled against her in hunger. I'll finish with the rabbits, Daniel offered. You tend to her. They moved around each other in the small cabin with an ease that surprised Eleanor. By the time darkness fell, they had shared a simple but filling meal of rabbit stew, and Daniel had revealed a hidden talent for storytelling, recounting tales of his early days in the territory that made Eleanor laugh for the first time in months. Sarah lay contentedly on a blanket near the fire, gurgling at the shadows dancing on the ceiling. Daniel sat cross-legged beside her, carving a small wooden rattle while Eleanor mended a tear in her dress. She has your eyes? Daniel observed, tickling Sarah's belly with a gentle finger. Eleanor glanced up from her sewing. And her father's temper, I fear. She can scream louder than seems possible for something so small. Spirit, Daniel corrected. Not temper. There's a difference. The distinction struck Eleanor as profound. Vernon had always called her willful and stubborn, as if her desire for basic kindness was a character flaw. Daniel saw strength where Vernon had seen defiance. Thank you, she said suddenly. Daniel looked up from his carving. For what? For seeing us. Really seeing us. Eleanor struggled to explain. Not as broken things or burdens or property. Daniel supplied quietly. Eleanor nodded, throat tight. Yes. Outside, an owl called into the darkness, its lonely cry echoing across the clearing. Daniel rose to stoke the fire, adding another log from the pile beside the hearth. I've been thinking, he said, back still turned to her, about what happens next. Eleanor's hands stilled on her mending. This was it, then. He'd helped them, fed them, sheltered them. Now he would send them on their way, as any reasonable man would. The path to Missoula won't be clear for another 2 weeks at least, Daniel continued. And even then, Vernon's likely to have men watching the train station. Eleanor's heart sank. She hadn't thought that far ahead, had only focused on getting away, on keeping Sarah safe. But, Daniel added, turning to face her, there's another option, if you're willing to consider it. Eleanor waited, afraid to hope. You could stay, he said simply. Not just until the weather clears, but longer. Stay, Eleanor repeated, not comprehending. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly awkward. As my housekeeper, if anyone asks. The cabin needs a woman's touch, truth be told. and I've more land than I can work alone. The offer hung in the air between them. Not charity, but an exchange. Her skills for his protection. Vernon would still come, Eleanor said hesitantly. Let him. Daniel's voice hardened. Any man who hunts a woman and child deserves what he gets. The conviction in his words sent a shiver through Eleanor. Not of fear, but of something like hope. Protection. Safety. The chance for Sarah to grow up without fear. I can cook, she said slowly. So, garden, though I'm not much good with root vegetables. And I can learn whatever I don't know. A ghost of a smile touched Daniel's lips. Is that a yes? Eleanor looked around the small cabin that had already begun to feel like more of a home than Vernon's grand house ever had. At Sarah, content and safe on her blanket. At this quiet, steadfast man who offered shelter without demands. Yes, she said, the word feeling like a door opening. We'll stay. Daniel nodded once, satisfaction and something else, something warmer, in his eyes. Good. That's settled, then. But nothing was truly settled, and they both knew it. Vernon's shadow still stretched between them, a threat lurking beyond the circle of firelight. And something else grew too, something neither of them had asked for or expected. As Eleanor prepared for bed that night, she caught Daniel watching her with an expression that made her heart beat faster. Not hunger or possession, the only male gazes she'd known, but wonder. As if she were something precious he'd discovered unexpectedly in this lonely place. She slipped beneath the quilt with Sarah nestled beside her, listening to Daniel bank the fire for the night. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring. But tonight they were safe. Tonight they were seen. And for now that was enough. Blood froze in Eleanor's veins as the cabin door crashed open. There stood Vernon, his shadow stretching across the floor like a demon's claw. Behind him waited two strangers with guns on their hips and eyes cold as river stones. Found you at last, Vernon snarled, his breath visible in the chilly air. He scanned the room, his gaze landing on the baby in Eleanor's arms. Playing house with a stranger while my child sleeps under his roof? Daniel wiped his hands calmly on a dish towel. Turning from the stew he stirred. Not a flicker of fear crossed his face, though Eleanor knew he kept no weapon within quick reach. Evening, gentlemen, Daniel said with surprising politeness. I don't believe we've met properly. Vernon ignored him, fixing his gaze on Eleanor. For days you've been gone. For days I've tracked you through mud and rain. His voice dropped dangerously. Pack your things. We're leaving. Eleanor clutched Sarah tighter. The baby sensed the tension and began to whimper. She's not going anywhere, Daniel said quietly, stepping forward. Not if she doesn't want to. Vernon's laugh was sharp as breaking ice. This isn't your business, Holt. That's my wife and my baby. Actually, Daniel replied, reaching for a tin box on the shelf. Eleanor Holt is my wife. What foolishness are you spitting? Vernon's hand moved to his belt. Daniel opened the box, removing a folded paper. Our marriage certificate. Signed by Pastor McKinnon last fall, witnessed by Judge Wilson himself. Eleanor's heart skipped. There was no certificate, they'd never met before the storm. Daniel was bluffing, creating a shield of words to protect them. The taller of Vernon's companions peered at Sarah, frowning. Boss, the baby don't look much like you. Got light hair, like his. Shut your mouth, Collins, Vernon snapped, but doubt flickered across his face. Daniel stepped closer to Eleanor, his shoulder now blocking Vernon's direct line to her. Judge Wilson has known me 15 years. Would you stand before him and call me a liar? Risk charges of harassment and trespassing on my property. Vernon's face darkened to a dangerous purple. You think papers protect you? Papers burn. So do cabins, Daniel replied evenly. But reputations last. The territory knows me as an honest man. They know you as a drunk who lost 2 farmhands last year under questionable circumstances. A shocked silence followed. Eleanor hadn't known about the farmhands, but the news didn't surprise her. Vernon's temper had always been deadly. You don't know who you're dealing with, Vernon growled. I believe I do. Daniel didn't raise his voice, didn't make a move toward the rifle mounted too far away on the wall. A man who beats women and threatens children isn't much of a mystery. The second stranger shifted uncomfortably. Vernon, maybe you should shut up. Vernon's hand flew to his hip where Eleanor knew he kept his hunting knife. Eleanor gasped, clutching Sarah tighter. The baby started to cry in earnest. "Shh, little one," Daniel said gently, not taking his eyes off Vernon. "Your mama's safe now." Something in Daniel's calm certainty made Vernon hesitate. His gaze darted around the cabin, taking in the neatly made bed, the cooking pot, the rocking chair pulled close to the fire. Signs of a life being built. "The sheriff knows you're here," Daniel continued. "So does Reverend McKinnon. Judge Wilson's expecting us for Sunday dinner." Each lie flowed smoothly into the next, creating a web of protection around Eleanor and Sarah. Vernon's knife remained half-drawn, his face twisted with rage. "This isn't over. For your sake it should be," Daniel replied. "If you value your freedom." The second stranger tugged at Vernon's sleeve. "Come on, boss. We can settle this proper with the law." Vernon spat on the clean-swept floor. "The law." His eyes locked with Eleanor's, burning with promise. "I'll be back, and next time there won't be talking." He backed toward the door, keeping his gaze fixed on Eleanor. "You'll regret this, Ella. Mark my words." Only when the thunder of hoofbeats faded into the distance did Eleanor's knees give way. She sank into the rocking chair, trembling so hard she feared she might drop Sarah. Daniel knelt before her, gently checking that the baby was unhurt. "You're safe now," he whispered. "He's gone." "For how long?" Eleanor's voice cracked. "He'll come back with more men. With real lawmen, maybe. He has friends in Missoula." Daniel's weathered face grew solemn. "That's why we need to act fast." "What do you mean?" His eyes met hers, steady and sure. "We need to make my lies into truth." Eleanor blinked, not understanding. "A real marriage certificate," Daniel explained. "Signed by a real pastor with real witnesses. Something no one could question." "You want us to actually marry?" Eleanor couldn't hide her shock. "It would protect you both legally," Daniel said. "Vernon couldn't claim Sarah, couldn't force you back." Eleanor studied his face, searching for hidden motives, for the spark of possession she'd seen in Vernon's eyes from their first meeting. Instead, she found only genuine concern. "Why would you do this? Tie yourself to strangers?" Daniel glanced at the daguerreotype on the mantel, his wife and son forever frozen in time. "Because no one should face the wilderness alone." His voice softened. "It doesn't have to be a real marriage in anything but name. You'd have your space, your freedom." Sarah's cries quieted to hiccuping sobs. Outside, twilight deepened toward night. A decision hung in the still air between them. "If Vernon comes back before we're legally wed," Eleanor couldn't finish the terrible thought. "I'll protect you," Daniel promised. "Both of you." Eleanor closed her eyes, weighing impossible choices. A loveless marriage of safety against the deadly freedom of flight. When she opened them again, her decision was made. "Yes," she whispered. "I'm willing." Neither of them saw the shadow that paused outside the window, listening, before melting back into the darkness. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Judge Wilson's parlor in Missoula, casting golden patterns across the polished wooden floor. Eleanor stood before a small mirror, barely recognizing herself in the borrowed blue dress. Mrs. Wilson fussed behind her, tucking a sprig of wildflowers into her hastily arranged hair. "There now," the older woman said kindly. "Every bride deserves something pretty on her wedding day, even when circumstances are unusual." Eleanor's fingers trembled as she touched the flowers. Just yesterday, she'd been running for her life. Today, she would become a stranger's wife. Through the doorway, she could see Daniel speaking quietly with Judge Wilson, their heads bent close together. What secrets was he sharing? How much had he told this respected man about her situation? Sarah cooed from her basket, drawing Eleanor's attention. The baby wore a lace christening gown borrowed from the pastor's wife, looking nothing like the desperate infant who'd fled through the wilderness in a dirty blanket. "Your Daniel seems a good man," Mrs. Wilson murmured, adjusting Eleanor's collar. "Known him since he was a boy. Never spoke ill of anyone. Even after the tragedy with Catherine and young James." Eleanor swallowed hard. "He's been very kind to us." Mrs. Wilson's shrewd eyes studied Eleanor's face. "Kindness is no small thing, especially out here. Sometimes it grows into something stronger, given time and care." Before Eleanor could respond, Judge Wilson called for them to begin. The ceremony would be brief, a legal necessity rather than a celebration. Daniel stood waiting, wearing a clean shirt and newly trimmed beard. A stab of guilt pierced Eleanor's heart. This man was sacrificing his freedom, his future, for people he barely knew. "You don't have to do this," she whispered as she took her place beside him. Daniel's reply was equally soft. "Yes, I do. And not just because of Vernon." Pastor McKinnon cleared his throat, Bible in hand. Judge Wilson and his wife stood witness, their expressions solemn but not unkind. "Dearly beloved," the pastor began, his voice filling the small parlor. Eleanor heard the words as if through water, distant and wavering. This wasn't the wedding she dreamed of as a young girl. Her first marriage had been joyful, with flowers and dancing, before Vernon revealed his true nature. Now she stood making vows for safety, not love. "Do you, Daniel James Holt, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Daniel's voice was steady. "I do. And do you, Eleanor May Tate, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Eleanor hesitated, the name striking her like a slap. She was still Vernon's in the eyes of the law. Daniel sensed her distress. "Pastor," he said quietly, "my bride was widowed some years ago. She's Eleanor May Collins." The lie flowed smoothly, creating yet another shield around them. The pastor nodded, correcting himself without question. "I do," Eleanor answered, her voice stronger than she expected, as Daniel slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. His mother's, he explained in a whisper. She felt the weight of it like a promise. Not of love, not yet, but of protection, of possibility. "By the power vested in me," Pastor McKinnon concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." No one suggested they kiss. Instead, Daniel squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. Judge Wilson produced the marriage certificate with a flourish. "Sign here, both of you. Mrs. Wilson and I will witness." The scratch of pen on paper sealed their fates together. Eleanor Holt. A new name. A new start. "I've taken the liberty," Judge Wilson said as they prepared to leave, "of sending word to Sheriff Blackwood about your situation. Without details, of course, but enough that he'll keep an eye out for troublemakers." Daniel nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Judge. Your discretion is appreciated." Mrs. Wilson pressed a small basket into Eleanor's hands. "Wedding cake," she explained, "and a few preserves for the baby when she's older." The kindness of these strangers brought unexpected tears to Eleanor's eyes. "Thank you," she managed. As they settled into the wagon for the journey home, she tested the word in her mind. Eleanor watched Daniel's profile against the bright spring sky. His jaw was set in determined lines, his shoulders straight despite the burden he'd taken on. "I have something for you," he said suddenly, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a folded paper and handed it to her. "Open it when you're ready." Eleanor unfolded it carefully. Inside was a deed to the homestead, with both their names listed as owners. "I don't understand," she whispered. "If anything happens to me," Daniel explained, keeping his eyes on the trail ahead, "the land is yours, free and clear. You and Sarah will never be without shelter." The enormity of the gift stole Eleanor's breath. Land ownership was freedom for a woman, rare and precious. "Why would you do this?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "Because I know what it means to lose everything." He glanced back at Sarah, sleeping peacefully in her basket. "And because everyone deserves a chance to build something new." As they crested the final hill before the valley that held the homestead, Eleanor gasped. The cabin stood as they'd left it, but beside it bloomed an explosion of yellow wildflowers, bright against the green grass. "The first spring I lived here alone," Daniel said softly, "I scattered Catherine's favorite flower seeds. Every year they come back stronger." Eleanor touched his arm lightly. "They're beautiful." "Yes," he agreed, but his eyes weren't on the flowers. "Beauty finds its way back, even to the most wounded places." Something shifted between them in that moment. A tiny spark neither was ready to name. That evening, after they'd unpacked the wagon and settled Sarah in her cradle, an awkward silence fell. The single bed stood in the corner, a physical reminder of their new arrangement. "I'll sleep by the fire," Daniel said, already gathering blankets to make a pallet on the floor. "You don't have to," Eleanor began. "Yes, I do," he interrupted gently. "This marriage is for protection, nothing more. You need never worry about expectations." Relief and something like disappointment mingled in Eleanor's chest. "Thank you," she said, turning down the lamp, "for everything." In the darkness, Daniel's voice came softly. "I'm not a perfect man, Eleanor. I've made my share of mistakes. But I promise you this. I will never hurt you or Sarah. I will never raise my voice or hand to either of you. And I will respect whatever boundaries you set between us." Tears pricked Eleanor's eyes. Such simple promises, yet they meant more than all Vernon's grand declarations of love ever had. "Good night, Daniel," she whispered. "Good night, Mrs. Holt," he replied, a smile in his voice. Eleanor lay awake long after Daniel's breathing deepened into sleep. Outside, an owl called softly to its mate. Inside, a family unlike any other began to take root. Her fingers found the gold band on her left hand, twisting it gently. Not a love match, she reminded herself. A practical arrangement for mutual benefit. Yet as she drifted toward sleep, the image that followed her was not of legal papers or protective walls, but of yellow flowers blooming against all odds in a place once touched by sorrow. Sometimes the heart found its way home by the most unexpected paths. Blood dripped from the dead rabbit hanging at Daniel's belt as he rode back toward the homestead. The first frost had kissed the valley that morning, turning the meadow grass silver white and warning of the winter to come. 6 months had passed since the day Eleanor and baby Sarah stumbled into his life, changing everything. 6 months of slow-growing trust, of learning each other's ways, of building something neither dared name yet. Daniel spotted smoke rising from the cabin chimney and smiled. Eleanor would have soup simmering, rabbit stew tonight, with the carrots and potatoes they'd harvested together last week. Sarah would be crawling on the bearskin rug before the hearth, babbling her newfound words. Home. He had a home again. He didn't see the men watching from the ridge until it was too late. The shot came without warning. Pain exploded through Daniel's shoulder, knocking him from his horse. He hit the ground hard, the world spinning as he scrambled for cover behind a fallen log. Blood soaked his shirt, hot and sticky against his skin. Another bullet splintered bark inches from his head. "That was just a greeting, Holt," a voice called across the clearing. "Next one goes through your heart unless you listen carefully." Daniel recognized that voice. Vernon Tate, Eleanor's first husband. The man whose threats had faded with summer's passing, until they'd almost believed he'd given up his claim. "What do you want, Tate?" Daniel shouted, pressing his hand against his wounded shoulder. Vernon stepped into view atop the ridge, flanked by 2 rough-looking men. "Just came to collect what's mine. My wife, my child." "They're not yours," Daniel growled. "The law says." "The law." Vernon laughed, the sound echoing across the valley. "Out here, the law is whatever a man with a gun says it is." One of Vernon's companions lifted his rifle, aiming at Daniel's position. "Here's how this plays out," Vernon continued. "You stay put while my friend keeps his sights on you. Jeb here rides to your cabin with a message for Eleanor. She comes to me willingly, or we put a bullet in your other shoulder. Then your knee. Then your gut. She'll watch you die slow before I take her anyway." Fear gripped Daniel's heart. Not for himself, but for Eleanor. For Sarah. "She won't come." Vernon's smile was cold as the frost. "Oh, she will. A woman that's soft-hearted? She came back for you once before when you were just strangers. Now that she's grown attached. He made a dismissive gesture. Jeb, deliver the message. The second man spurred his horse down the slope, heading toward the cabin. Daniel's mind raced. His rifle was still in its scabbard on his spooked horse, now grazing calmly 50 yards away. The revolver he kept tucked in his boot was useless at this distance. If he moved, the watchman would shoot. If he didn't, Eleanor would walk into Vernon's trap. She's not the same woman you knew, Tate, Daniel called, playing for time. She's stronger now. Strong enough to watch you bleed out? Vernon countered. Daniel had no answer for that. The terrible truth was that Eleanor's compassion, the very quality that had first touched his heart, might now lead her into danger. The minutes crawled by like hours as Daniel's blood seeped between his fingers. His vision began to blur at the edges. How much time had passed? How long before Jeb reached the cabin? Before Eleanor received Vernon's message? A movement in the trees behind Vernon caught Daniel's fading attention. A flash of blue? Eleanor's dress? No, impossible. She wouldn't leave Sarah alone. Unless, understanding dawned just as a new voice rang out. Vernon Tate, this is Sheriff Mackenzie. Drop your weapons. 3 mounted men emerged from the treeline, rifles raised. The sheriff, his deputy, and Daniel blinked in disbelief. Abraham Abbott, their neighbor. Vernon whirled in surprise, his rifle swinging toward the new threat. The sheriff's shot cracked across the clearing before Vernon could fire. The bullet caught Vernon's companion in the arm. He dropped his weapon with a howl of pain. Vernon dove for cover among the rocks. Bullets flew as the clearing erupted in gunfire. Daniel seized his chance. Gathering his remaining strength, he sprinted for his horse, ignoring the fire in his shoulder. A bullet kicked up dirt at his heels. Another whizzed past his ear. Then his hand closed around his rifle. He yanked it free, spun, and fired in one fluid motion. Vernon cried out, clutching his leg where Daniel's bullet had found its mark. His rifle clattered down the rocky slope. "It's over, Tate," the sheriff bellowed. "Surrender or the next one won't just clip you." The shooting stopped. In the sudden silence, Daniel heard only his own ragged breathing and the distant cry of a hawk. Vernon slowly raised his hands, his face twisted with rage. "This changes nothing, Holt," he spat. "She's still mine by rights." The sheriff dismounted, approaching with caution. "Rights?" he echoed, disgust evident in his voice. "The only rights you've got are to a fair trial before we hang you for attempted murder." He glanced at Daniel. "You all right, Holt?" Daniel nodded weakly, his strength ebbing. "Eleanor, Sarah, safe," Abraham assured him, riding closer. "That's why we're here. Eleanor sent my boy Jimmy running to fetch us the minute that stranger appeared at your door. Smart woman, your wife. Wrote out exactly what was happening and where to find you." Relief washed through Daniel like a flood, stronger than the pain of his wound. Eleanor hadn't fallen for Vernon's trap. She'd outplayed him at his own game. "Where is she?" he managed, swaying on his feet. "At our place with the children and my Martha," Abraham replied. "She wanted to come, but..." Daniel didn't hear the rest. The world tilted sideways as darkness claimed him. When he opened his eyes again, he was lying on a cot in what he recognized as the sheriff's office in Missoula. His shoulder was bandaged, the pain dulled to a persistent throb. Night had fallen, lamplight casting long shadows across the wooden floor. "Daniel," Eleanor's voice. He turned his head to find her sitting beside him, her face pale with worry, her eyes red-rimmed from tears. Sarah slept peacefully in her arms. "You didn't come," he whispered. Eleanor's free hand found his, fingers intertwining. "I couldn't. Not with Sarah. Not when I knew what he'd do." Her voice broke. "I couldn't lose you both." "Smart thinking," he murmured. "Getting word to the Abbotts. I remembered what you taught me. Always have another way out. Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I was so afraid I'd be too late." Daniel squeezed her hand. "Where's Vernon?" "In the cell down the hall. The sheriff says he'll stand trial for attempted murder, along with his men. Eleanor's voice hardened. They found wanted posters in Vernon's saddlebags. He's been robbing stagecoaches in Idaho Territory. He won't trouble us again. A weight lifted from Daniel's chest. It's really over then. Eleanor nodded, her gaze dropping to their joined hands. There's something else you should know. Daniel waited, searching her face. When I thought I might lose you today, Eleanor took a shaky breath. I realized something I've been too afraid to admit. Sarah stirred in her sleep, tiny fingers curling against her mother's sleeve. Eleanor looked from her daughter to Daniel, vulnerability and determination mingling in her eyes. Our marriage may have started as a way to keep Vernon away, she said softly. But somewhere along the way it became real, at least for me. The words hung between them, weighted with possibility. Daniel felt warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with his wound. Eleanor. The door swung open, the sheriff's bulky frame filling the doorway. Glad to see you awake, Holt. Doc says you're lucky. Bullet went clean through. Daniel nodded, distracted. What had Eleanor been about to confess? And what had he been about to say in return? The sheriff continued, unaware of the moment he'd interrupted. I've taken statements from the Abbotts and my deputy who witnessed the shooting. Tate and his men will face the judge when the circuit court comes through next month. He fixed Eleanor with a sympathetic look. Mrs. Holt, you'll need to testify about your history with the prisoner. Eleanor paled but nodded firmly. I'll say whatever needs saying to keep him away from my family. The word family echoed in Daniel's mind. Their family. Unconventional in its beginnings, perhaps, but no less real for that. Get some rest, both of you, the sheriff advised. I've arranged rooms at the hotel. Mrs. Mackenzie will help with the little one. After he left, silence settled between them again, heavy with unspoken words. What were you going to say? Daniel finally asked. Before the sheriff came in, Eleanor met his gaze, something vulnerable yet determined in her eyes. I was going to say that I don't want to sleep in separate rooms anymore. Her cheeks flushed. Not tonight. Not ever again. Daniel's breath caught. Are you sure? I've never been more sure of anything, she whispered. I thought I'd lost you today, and all I could think was how much I'd left unsaid, how many chances I'd wasted because I was afraid. Ignoring the pain in his shoulder, Daniel reached up to touch her cheek. We have time now, he promised. All the time in the world. As the lamplight flickered, casting their shadows together on the wall, Daniel wondered if this was what redemption felt like. Not the absence of scars, but the promise of healing together, of building something new from broken pieces. Outside the window, the first snow of winter began to fall. The north field lay bathed in late afternoon light, tall grass rippling like water under the gentle breeze. Eleanor crouched at the forest's edge, Sarah safely delivered to the Abbotts with her hastily written note explaining everything. Mrs. Abbott had clasped her hand with fierce understanding, promising to send her husband for the sheriff immediately. But Eleanor couldn't wait. Each passing minute meant Daniel's life draining away, if he still lived at all. She spotted him almost immediately, slumped against the half-mended fence, his shirt darkened with blood. Vernon stood nearby, rifle in hand, while two men, the same ones who had accompanied him to the cabin months ago, kept watch from horseback. Taking a steadying breath, Eleanor emerged from the tree-line, the small revolver concealed in the folds of her skirt. Vernon, she called, her voice carrying across the field. All three men turned. Vernon's face split into a triumphant smile that turned Eleanor's stomach. I knew you'd come, he said as she approached. A wife always returns to her rightful husband. Let me see to Daniel first, she demanded, ignoring his barb. Vernon gestured magnanimously with the rifle. By all means, say your goodbyes to the man who stole what was mine. Eleanor knelt beside Daniel, her heart lurching at the pallor of his face. Blood soaked his left side, but his eyes fluttered open at her touch. Eleanor, he rasped, you shouldn't have come. Sarah is safe, she assured him quietly. The Abbotts have her. Relief washed over his features. Good. That's good. How touching. Vernon sneered from behind them. Now step away from him, Eleanor. We're leaving. She pressed her hand against Daniel's wound, feeling the steady, if weakened, thrum of his heartbeat beneath her fingers. The bullet went through, she murmured. You'll live if the bleeding stops. Daniel's hand closed weakly around her wrist. Don't do this, he whispered. Don't go with him. I don't intend to, Eleanor replied, so softly only Daniel could hear. She slipped the revolver from her skirt into his hand. When I stand, be ready. Understanding flickered in his eyes. He gave an almost imperceptible nod. Eleanor rose slowly, turning to face Vernon. I'll go with you, she said, stepping deliberately to position herself between Daniel and Vernon's line of sight. But I want your word that you'll leave Daniel alone, that you'll never come after Sarah. Vernon laughed, a harsh sound that echoed across the field. You're in no position to negotiate, Eleanor. You and the child belong to me. I'll decide what happens to her, and to your lover. Then you've learned nothing, Eleanor said, her voice growing stronger. I belong to no one but myself. Spirited as ever, Vernon spat. I see Holt hasn't broken that out of you yet. No matter. I will. He gestured to his men. Finish him. We'll make it look like a robbery gone wrong. One of the men dismounted, drawing his pistol. No! Eleanor cried, lunging forward as though to physically intervene. The distraction was all Daniel needed. With strength born of desperation, he raised the revolver and fired. The shot caught Vernon square in the chest, the impact throwing him backward into the tall grass. Chaos erupted. The hired man fired wildly, his bullet whistling past Eleanor's ear. Daniel's second shot found its mark, and the man crumpled. The remaining rider, witnessing the swift turn of fortune, wheeled his horse around and galloped away without looking back. In the sudden, ringing silence, Eleanor rushed to Daniel's side. The effort of shooting had drained what little strength he had left, and his face was gray with pain. Stay with me, she urged, tearing strips from her petticoat to bind his wound. The Abbotts are sending help. Daniel's eyes found hers, clear despite his weakness. You came back, he murmured. You could have taken Sarah and run. Eleanor's hands stilled on the makeshift bandage. Of course I came back. This is my home. She swallowed hard. You are my home now. Something shifted in Daniel's gaze, surprise giving way to a tenderness that caught at Eleanor's heart. I think, he said softly, I'm falling in love with my wife, despite everything. The blood, the danger, the uncertain future stretching before them. Eleanor felt a smile break across her face like sunrise after the longest night. What a coincidence, she whispered, bending to press her forehead against his. I believe I'm falling in love with my husband. In the distance, hoofbeats approached. The sheriff and the doctor, Eleanor hoped. Help had arrived, but she realized with quiet certainty that she and Daniel had already saved each other in all the ways that truly mattered. As the golden summer light bathed the field around them, Eleanor thought of Sarah, of the homestead that had become their refuge, of the family they were building. Not from obligation or necessity, but from choice. From love. We're going to be all right, she said, and for the first time in her life, Eleanor Holt truly believed it. In the Montana wilderness of 1885, a woman fleeing abuse discovered that true freedom isn't found in escape alone, but in the courage to trust again. And in doing so, she found not just safety, but a love born of respect, kindness, and shared resilience. Her worth, never determined by another's cruelty, blossomed in the light of her own strength and the genuine connection she forged with a man who saw her not as property to be claimed, but as a partner to be cherished.